Coincidental.
Chapter 7 Cultural Incapacity for God, the Absence of God's Reality. Theologically speaking, every age is post-Christian. This means that every man in every situation stands under God's judgment. They constantly need to be measured against the yardstick of God's justice and must be, time and again, redeemed from their natural propensity toward corruption and sinfulness. Just as no man is holy once and for all, so also no situation exhibits the reality of God's presence once and for all. If men are in need of constant renewal, human achievements and cultural realizations need to be revised almost instantaneously. This applies to every man, to every generation, to every age. It applies particularly to Christendom, and even more particularly to Christianity, especially at a time when the churches have comfortably slipped into the hedonism of religiosity. Such a claim about the post-Christian character emerges directly from the New Testament. Quite apart from the book of Revelation, really the first book to claim that this age is post-Christian, Jesus, on more than one occasion during his lifetime, rebuked his disciples for lacking faith, although they were full of religiosity, as Peter was when he thought that the Christ could not suffer. Jesus even observed, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Christian ideals of one generation invariably degenerate by the time another generation rises up. But Christendom in the past always displayed enough strength to correct this process. The parallelism between the situation of the last century and a half and that of Christendom's expansion into the barbarian provinces of Europe is pertinent. Charles Williams's assessment of Christianization of those areas fits the predicament of modern Christianity. The missionaries pressed out with the gospel precisely as the parish priests baptized babies. Christendom moved outward in space as it attempted to move forward in time. There is no other institution which suffers from time so much as religion. At the moment when it is remotely possible that a whole generation might have learned something both of theory and practice, the learners and their learning are removed by death, and the church is confronted by the necessity of beginning all over again. The whole labor of regenerating mankind has to begin again every 30 years or so. Charles Williams goes on to indicate the reason why the present situation differs from that of the Christendom of the Dark Ages. The difference is that, in spite of all its temptations and difficulties, Christendom had really achieved a nature. It is this nature which is now spent or does not accord itself with the modern condition of man. Because this age is post-Christian culturally, Christianity has lost its relevance. Being intrinsically bound to a decaying cultural pattern, it cannot extricate itself from the compromises it has engendered and the allegiances by which it shaped the past. To say, therefore, that this age is post-Christian culturally is a much more serious indictment of Christianity than the homiletic reminder that every age comes anew under God's judgment. The latter is meaningful only to the extent that Christianity really and positively acts as a leaven in any given cultural framework. But today, the structures of the world have changed from top to bottom, and Christianity, it seems, has been left out of them. Retrospect and prospect. This age is post-Christian not only theologically, but also culturally. Theologically, no age, no culture, no nation, no society is Christian, just as no man is, but becomes a Christian continually. This age is post-Christian culturally, and that man cannot even become a Christian. The fundamentals of our culture, those things that govern our self-understanding, make us impervious to the conception of Christianity. The worldview of Christianity is transcendental, ours is immanental. The divergence is not only theological, it is also cultural. The leveling down can be seen not only in the failure of faith and the quest for consistency which accompany it, it can also be seen in the social and political realms. Western culture has evinced the masks of this leveling down. Since the end of the 18th century, almost every historical event points to it. Both the American and the French revolutions not only brought social and political changes, they also ushered in, or simply endorsed, cultural as well as theological transformations. Political liberty was and remains the most spectacular achievement of these two revolutions, But the American Revolution was also the herald of theological liberty, as shown by the subsequent First Amendment of the American Constitution. The French proclaimed the same ideal by more or less official attempts to mark the end of what might be called the ecclesiastical era of Western culture. On the American continent, the traditional Christian concepts of ransom, redemption, and forgiveness were deprived of their ethical and social connotations and implications, and were taken over by the more democratic, if not yet purely secular ideals of justice, constitutional government, and moral law. Gradually, theological liberty, which at first meant freedom from dogmatic restraint or constraint, more and more imperturbably signified freedom from theology. Nor did it take long to find that concrete justice is a more relevant factor in the business of daily existence than any agreement or disagreement on a substitutionary theory about an otherworldly justice. The French Revolution marks even more emphatically, though sometimes in a tragically ostentatious way, the repudiation of ecclesiastical authority and its exclusion from the pursuit of political emancipation and social adjustments. The decapitation of the French king not only is synonymous, as Camus suggests, with the death of God which Nietzsche was later to proclaim, it also brings to an end the ecclesiastically controlled civilization which Christianity had inspired until then. The Reformation had shaken this ecclesiastical control, but in its beginnings at least, it had substituted the conception of a civilization reinforced by the sporadic control of various brands of theologies. And such matters as civilization, built on the foundations of the Reformation, was not less authoritarian, as Troeltsch points out in Protestantism and Progress, than the coercion exerted by Christianity in the Middle Ages. But by the beginning of the 19th century, both versions of Christian culture, one under ecclesiastic and the other under theological control, had officially been discarded. The ensuing expansion of Christianity in Africa and elsewhere was a posthumous tribute to the cultural significance of Christianity, now superseded in its homeland. Within the provinces of Christianity, a secularization of religion had meanwhile been taking place, and the secular institutions now arrogated to themselves what sacral aura they could capture from the religious ones. The rights of man disestablished God's redemptive covenant, democracy evicted the communion of the saints, and the attributes of God were now conceived as simply the highest predicates of man. But the divine and the transcendental categories through which the purpose of human existence was annotated and elucidated did not expire. At the same time as God was identified with the essence of man, man himself was deified, and a general apotheosis enveloped and transfigured man no less than the tools and institutions with which he annexed the world and conquered his destiny. In this context, Ludwig Feuerbach, by the middle of the 19th century, could claim that theology is anthropology, that nothing other than the knowledge of man is divine, and that God is but a notion derived from the highest and purest predicates of man. All this Feuerbach candidly deduces from what he considers the essence of Christianity. Those that would accuse him of committing a sacrilege he rebuffs with the expostulation that when Christianity lowered God into man, it made man into God. Feuerbach was recording the collapse of theology, just as the French Revolution had recorded the disintegration of ecclesiastical dominion over civilization, as well as the eclipse of God, which became a fact as soon as God was conceived of as a clockmaker or an absentee landlord. The contemporary theologian Karl Barth argues in his essay on Feuerbach that theology had already become anthropology, ever since Protestantism itself, and especially Luther, emphatically shifted the interest from what God is in himself to what God is for man. Its course of development runs uninterruptedly in such a direction that man more and more renounces God and addresses himself. In Feuerbach's words, so long as man adores a good being as his God, so long does he contemplate in God the goodness of his own nature, he who makes God act humanly declares human activity to be divine. He says, a God who is not active and not morally or humanly active is no God. And thus he makes the idea of the Godhead dependent on the idea of activity, that is, of human activity, for a higher he knows not. The classical dogmas have lost one of their chief functions, that of protecting man's mind by delineating the sphere of human speculation and action, even as the city of God, under the aspect of the church, no longer delimits the area of social and political activity. In neither respect can Christianity pragmatically reinforce its claim as the protector of man's body or of man's mind. To neither field does it seem to be now pertinent. Retrospectively, this accounts for the ambiguous feeling discernible in Montesquieu's ejaculation. Admirable thing, the Christian religion, which seems to have no purpose other than felicity in the afterlife, still makes our happiness in this life. The advantages which the establishment of Christianity had allegedly procured for the human race, and which Turgot extolled in the discourse at the Sorbonne in 1750, were no longer self-evident, excepting that, for want of a more direct suzerainty of the Christian faith and morality over the ways of the world, the idea of an afterlife was still honored with some degree of acquiescence. Cultural incapacity for God. The post-Christian cultural framework in which modern man lives and moves is reflected in the contrast between the Christian and the modern conception of man. According to the former, human nature is understood within a transcendental frame of reference. St. Paul said in the Areopagus, reminiscing a line from Epimenides for apologetic purposes, "In him we live and move and have our being." Whatever Epimenides meant, St. Paul's point is that man knows himself in proportion as he knows God, and that he finds himself only if he seeks God. St. Augustine later emphatically declared, "God and the soul do I desire to know, nothing more, nothing at all." In the 16th century, Calvin was even more systematically emphatic when he began the first paragraph of his major work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, with these statements. True and substantial wisdom principally consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. But while these two branches of knowledge are so intimately connected, which of them precedes and produces the other is not easy to discover. For in the first place, no man can take a survey of himself, but he must immediately turn to the contemplation of God. Nor can we really aspire toward him till we've begun to be displeased with ourselves. On the other hand, it is plain that no man can arrive at the true knowledge of himself without having first contemplated the divine character, and then descended to the consideration of his own. Even the interpretation of the essence of Christianity in Harnack's liberal theology has two foci, God and the soul and its God. No doubt contemporary theologians would agree on the interdependence of the knowledge of God and self-knowledge, but they do so in a different context. This context is non-Christian in a more basic sense than Bishop Lilje depicted when he declared, "The scenery for Christianity has changed in our time more deeply and more fundamentally than most church people realize. We do live, for all practical purposes, in a non-Christian world." If only the scenery were non-Christian, the contrast between now and past epochs of Christianity would be simply one of degree. But the difference is so fundamental that it can only be depicted by pointing to the culturally post-Christian nature of this age. This period is not even anti-Christian. If it were non-Christian or anti-Christian, one could be witness unto it, even a martyr. Any of these possibilities would appear natural. Holden Caulfield, in Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, reflects the true temper of the age when he remarks about ministers that they all have these Holy Joe voices when they start giving their sermons. God, I hate that. I don't see why the hell they can't talk in their natural voices. There is no correlation any longer between the Christian faith and the modern situation of man. That is why Christianity seems, in the word of a post-Christian, unnatural. What is taking place on the stage of Western culture is not a struggle against God for God, to use Jasper's phrase in describing the book of Job. In order to struggle against God for God, man needs faith. Such a struggle ceases as soon as faith dies. This faith has died from its own application. If the knowledge of God is essential to self-knowledge, the traditional Christian optimism about human destiny must be relevant to the human situation. That the Christian tradition realized this is shown historically by the philosophical, artistic, and even technological reality of Christian culture. The Christian tradition understood this relevance so well that it always affirmed in one form or another, though perhaps more or less unhappily, That commitment to God implied involvement in the world, and conversely, that man's involvement in the world should be concerned with the ultimate goal of God's glorification. Man's involvement in the affairs of the world was never separated from the transcendental frame of reference in which self-understanding took place. Today, only the reality of the world, and all its immediacy and its immanence, provides man with a context for possible self-understanding. This self-understanding is amputated from any necessity of a fundamental knowledge of God. It is easier to understand oneself without God than with God. Modern man lives in a world of immanence. If he is the prey of anxiety, it is not because he feels guilty before a just God, nor is it because he fails to explain the justice and love of God in the obvious presence of evil and injustice. God is no longer responsible for the world, since he is dead. But man is. He cannot avoid assuming full responsibility for a world of immanence, in terms of which he knows and understands himself or seeks to do so. The dilemma of Christianity is that it taught man how to be responsible for his actions in this world and for this world itself. Now man has declared God not responsible and not relevant to human self-knowledge. The existence of God, no longer questioned, has become useless to man's predicament and its resolution. Jean Giono's position is logical. Only a human paganism can save modern man, or deliberately post-Christian humanism like that of Camus and many others. In contrast to the Christian position which advocates, find God and you will find yourself, this kind of humanism proposes, as a contributor to the Village Voice sums it up, find yourself and you will not need to find God. In the words of the dean of the Harvard Divinity School, the post-Christian man is not hostile to religion or even concerned. He simply does not raise the religious question at all, not even in church. The churches themselves continue to think that Christianity remains a positive factor in the shaping of the emergent civilization. So also did the Hellenistic syncretism of the dying Roman Empire believe concerning its religions. Admittedly, not only was there no room for primitive Christianity within the structures of Roman society, but its very nature excluded it from them. Yet it overcame them. Christopher Dawson, believing that contemporary Christianity is in a similar situation, writes with confidence, "The same tradition which proved victorious over the pagan world in the past exists today. For though the church no longer inspires and dominates the external culture of the modern world, it still remains the guardian of all the riches of its own inner life and is the bearer of a sacred tradition." He goes on to interpret rather devoutly the contemporary invalidation of Christianity as a latent movement toward Christian culture, and as a return to our own fatherland, to the sacred tradition of the Christian past, which flows underneath the streets and cinemas and skyscrapers of the New Babylon, as the tradition of the patriarchs and prophets flowed beneath the palaces and amphitheaters of imperial Rome. There are two major differences which Mr. Dawson eloquently overlooks. The first is that this civilization of asphalt and glamour and reinforced concrete is not merely pagan. It is primarily post-Christian. It is the heir of a Christian culture and its sacred tradition. Secondly, primitive Christianity was, comparatively speaking, in a position of strength. It could afford to look forward, whereas 20th century Christianity seems caught in a nostalgic whirl, and it looks backward to what is taken for a golden age. How could Christianity disassociate itself from the implications of its own cultural and technological achievements? Is it because Dawson and Maritain and Bonhoeffer think it could or should that they envision the flowering of a new Christian culture as a concrete possibility? How can they forget that all interplay of religion and culture creates bondage, and that religion is only significant to the degree that it is bound to a culture? Of course, the eventuality of commencing another interplay is plausible theoretically, but this plausibility hinges on the degree of receptivity the cardinal Christian categories will find in the structures of a given culture. How can this happen if these structures have become impervious to these categories? The devaluation of the fundamental categories of the Christian faith, of those that gave birth to the Christian culture, has reached such a point that the imperviousness of our world to the ideas and values characteristic of Christianity can be observed in practice. Medieval civilization spent itself on building churches, cathedrals, and monasteries. Today in Paris, the tourist will visit Notre Dame, but he will also ride in the elevator to the top of the Eiffel Tower. Or in New York, he will be attracted by the Empire State Building or Radio City Music Hall or Rockefeller Center at the same time as some imitation Gothic churches incongruously recreate for him a feeling of the past. Professor Sorokin claims that in the 12th and 13th centuries, 97% of the subjects in the fine arts were devoted to religious motifs, against 3% depicting secular life, and that in the 20th century the ratio is almost exactly the opposite. Whatever else these figures may mean, they certainly indicate that a concern has shifted from transcendentals to immanentals. The gap between the categories of the Christian faith and the realities and aspirations of this world grows wider and wider. This disparateness, becoming more and more accentuated, can only result in the withdrawal of this world from the trusteeship of Christianity. A question arises that cannot be silenced by mere assent to the Christian tradition, a twofold question dealing with the permanency of the Christian religion and the fate of Western culture. The question is this: does the present age manifest any need for categories of faith? Or is the present stage of Western culture strongly enough mature and integrated to go at it alone? After having thanked Christianity for the formative role it has played and forthwith dismissing it. Christianity and the present cultural crisis. Some Christians believe in the permanency of the Christian religion and its cultural tradition. Others, like Karl Jaspers, place on record their radical pessimism about a culture which has become impervious to the categories of faith. They argue that, unless this particular age is motivated by some transcendental persuasion, its body and soul will become paralyzed, and total disintegration will both engulf this civilization and destroy any grain of faith that might still be dormant in it. Still others are not so pessimistic, either about the imprudent present or the no less imprudent future, which they think will yield a new raison d'etre. Pitrim Sorkin has taken notice of and set into evidence the transition from a sacral to a secular form of culture. But he vehemently disagrees with those who claim that in the present crisis, Western culture and society are agonizing to their death. His argument seeks to invalidate the theories based on a biological analogy, that every culture and society should pass through the stages of childhood, maturity, senility, and death. Claiming that no evidence for such a theory is irrefutably given, Sorokin argues in The Crisis of Our Age that the complete disintegration of our culture and society is impossible. Also, for the reason that the total sum of social and cultural phenomena of Western society and culture has never been integrated into one unified system. What has not been integrated cannot, it is evident, disintegrate. He does admit that the present crisis may signify one of the greatest possible revolutions of our cultural and social life. By this, Sorokin certainly cannot mean a comparatively simple change from one political or economic structure to another. He must mean the substitution of a fundamental idea of culture for another. From any approach to the present crisis, the impact of Christianity on Western culture is no longer what it used to be. Is there yet any possibility of separating the denouement of the present desuetude of Christianity from that of today's crisis? So far as this age is post-Christian culturally, to what extent is the desuetude of Christianity a phenomenon only marking, or attributable to, the crisis this cultural system of values is undergoing, and which Christianity, restored and rehabilitated, would ultimately outlast? A good tree needs pruning. Could it be that the current eclipse of Christianity is caused by an inevitable accumulation of cultural accessories that will in due time be cast away, especially since the more frequent and unmasking confrontations between Christians and non-Christian cultures will lay bare the decadent aspect of these accessories? Hypothetically, Christianity could then achieve a seminal and spiritual recovery which would set it on a new course. Such a thesis rests on three assumptions. First, the fate of Christianity is not irrevocably but only partially bound to that of Western culture. Second, if such is the case, the crisis of this age is only a theological one. Third, the presumed vitality as well as the universality of the Christian religion is independent of the seeming disintegration of its cultural accomplishments. This threefold thesis does not deny the bond between Christianity and Western culture. It cannot therefore deny that Christianity is to some extent responsible for the decadence of Western culture. It concedes that the present crisis, because it is mainly cultural, is at the same time a religious, though not necessarily Christian, crisis. Accordingly, the conflict is not between Christianity and the contemporary cultural structures and values, it is between Christianity and the antithetical values or anthropological systems, which are essentially religious although not Christian. In line with this general formulation, the conflict of religious forces becomes as a nodal agony within Christianity. A similar crisis took place when Christianity, from being a Jewish sect, became the religion of all Europe. Even while diverging more and more radically from Judaism, it became the inheritor of the Greco-Roman legacy. In order to assert its universality, Christianity had to discard a certain number of Jewish elements which were particularly restrictive or exclusivistic. On this theory, the present crisis is brought about by a threat to the validity and universality of Christianity by elements which subjugate it to a Western image of man and his place in the world. Shedding these elements, Christianity could once again emerge triumphant. Meanwhile, its agony is understandable because it is critically difficult to disincarnate Christianity from the culture it has shaped and on which it depends. Can Christianity disentangle itself from concepts which are now regarded as exclusively Western, without ceasing at the same time to be Christian? Did not early Christianity almost irreparably undergo a radical change when it broke away from Judaism in order to settle down in the European nations? In the same way that Christianity then seemed to stand or fall with its essential bond of kinship with Judaism, Christianity today seems to stand or fall with Western culture. In Civilization on Trial, Arnold Toynbee contends that, in contrast to the cyclic movement of the rises and falls of civilizations, the history of religion on Earth is a movement in a single continuous upward line. By extension, this would mean that if the religious sentiment, under one shape or another, has been progressing in an upward line, it will not necessarily preserve its Christian shape. Religion may be here to stay. This does not imply that Christianity is. Religiosity is as different from Christianity as the movement of religion is, according to Toynbee, from that of culture. That religiosity will not disappear simply because Christianity is ebbing is clear enough from evidences as disparate as the Soviet ideology, the burgeoning Buddhist mission to Germany, the attraction of Zen Buddhism, and the literature of the Beat generation. Apparently, Toynbee does not consider the question from that angle. He intimates that what might take place is a grafting of religious elements, especially from the Far East, onto Christianity in the same way, he contends, as Christianity during the Roman Empire adopted the best of other Oriental religions. When Rome fell, Christianity was its heir. Likewise, when the decline of this civilization has been completed, and Christianity has profited by its confrontation with other higher religions, Christianity may be left as their spiritual as well as cultural heir. Meanwhile, the primordial task is to purge Christianity of its Western accretions and to liberate it from its Western exclusivism. Toynbee is here not saying that Christianity is the best religion, but he does say that it may become the best religion, especially since religion progresses in an upward direction. He is not assigning any uncontestable superiority to Christianity or perpetuating the myth of Christianity's hegemony, at least not in the way this has until recently been done. But he is certainly implying that the future of Christianity does not hang on the doom of Western culture, and that all the higher religions can culminate in the expurgated and reinvigorated type of Christianity, presumably because there is within Christianity a latent tendency towards universality. A certain number of fallacies or misconceptions taint this argument and the assumptions it is based on. First of all, there is some validity in the claim that Christianity is not bound up with Western culture. It did not sufficiently penetrate the civilization it inherited from Greece and Rome, and it is not apt to do so now or in the future. There has been, as it were, a complicity between Christianity and what became Western culture. They have been conspirators, and now the masks are falling. Martin Buber points out that what was or is called Christendom differed significantly from the various nations that constituted it. As the continuous struggle between the papacy and the various monarchs indicate, the consciousness of a church was superimposed over that of the different nationalities. And so far as the first was not as strong as the second, since national loyalties never quite succumbed to the wider spiritual and cultural unity sought by the Church, the resulting unity of Christendom was less organic than the regional or national communities often were. The unification of moral and spiritual values was more desired than achieved. Western culture is precisely what supplies this unification. Paradoxically, it is not Christian enough for Christianity to be bound up with it, but it is too Christian for Christianity to disown it at this critical juncture. No matter how poorly the rest of his argument is carried on, this is what Dawson means in The Historic Reality of Christian Culture when he declares, "It is hardly too much to say that it is Christian culture that has created Western man and the Western way of life. But at the same time, we must admit that Western man has not been faithful to this Christian tradition." Dawson can allow himself to argue that Christian culture has still a chance of winning the Western way of life. But inasmuch as he must uphold a certain degree of consanguinity between Christianity and Western culture, he may not both have his cake and eat it too. He cannot attempt in good conscience to disculpate Christianity from the failure of Western culture. For if the revival of Christian civilization does not involve the creation of a totally new civilization, but rather the cultural reawakening or reactivation of the Christian minority, then it follows that whether their past relationship was successful or not, Christianity is bound up with Western culture. It is a truism to remark that the revival of Christian civilization does not involve the creation of a totally new civilization. The problem does not deal with what a revival of Christian civilization would involve, so much as with the opportunity of such a revival. T.S. Eliot holds that this opportunity, in the last resort, may not be available to Christianity. In The Idea of a Christian Society, he states his belief that the choice before us is between the formation of a new Christian culture and the acceptance of a pagan one. Both involve radical changes, but I believe that the majority of us, if we could be faced immediately with all the changes which will only be accomplished in several generations, would prefer Christianity. Perhaps. But the choice itself is not so clear-cut. Eliot knows that in reality, the crux of the matter is that the choice between a Christian and a post-Christian culture is not immediate, or at least it is consistent with itself and not seeming immediate. Even if, as Dawson claims, it is ultimately a choice between Christianity or nothing, it does not follow from our present diagnosis of a choice not immediately before us that, in Eliot's words, the only hopeful course for a society which would thrive and continue its creative activity in the arts of civilization is to become Christian. This amounts to saying that, except from a strictly homiletic standpoint, if Western culture falls, Christianity falls with it. The fraud that authors like Eliot and Dawson commit is to think, as Troeltsch once put it, that Christianity is the loftiest and most spiritual revelation we know, and that it has the highest validity. In a lecture given at Oxford in 1923 on the place of Christianity among the world religions, Troeltsch repudiated this thesis, which he had once upheld. He gave two types of reasons for his rejection of the thesis that Christianity's validity is supremely higher than that of other religions. The first are the scientifically or historically observable reasons from which he concluded that, regardless of the forms assumed by a religion, it cannot exist or manifest any validity without depending on a set of intellectual, social, and national conditions. From this, Troeltsch infers that the so-called supreme validity of a religion actually proceeds from a preferential treatment accorded the religio-cultural context into which a person is born. He concedes that, mutatis mutandis, all religions make similar claim. Their criterion for supreme validity operates only in the measure in which it has become ingrained in the texture of personal, social, or cultural conventions. Thus, a religion has supreme validity only for those who have shaped or been shaped by it, who have begotten it and are nourished by it. Lamennais indirectly anticipated this judgment. Attempting to base the authenticity of the supreme relevance of Christianity on an objective evidence, he starts from the premise that certitude is what the human race universally consents to. On this criterion, the reality and truth of a religious insight or aspiration are then developed, ultimately emerging into Christianity as into the apex of religion. Of course, this system would not have been hatched had not Lamennais been a victim of his particular religious sensitivity, and had he not assented to a belief in the universal mission of Western culture. From this analysis, not only does the concept of the supreme validity of Christianity recede into the background, but the corollary claim of the universality of Christianity loses its foundation. The second kind of reasons concerns the view that the best of all the other higher religions can be assumed into Christianity. That too, according to Troeltsch, is a fraud. It supposes that there is a common ground between Christianity and the other religions. Then Christianity is declared either superior to them or the culmination of them. This kind of speculation only aims to retain the lost hegemony of Christianity. Its basic sophistry consists in equating universality or superiority with relevancy. Personal conviction may be quite justified in wishing such an equation, but in terms of objective facts and considerations, it is difficult to find any instance confirming so personal a conviction beyond the limits of subjectivism. Troeltsch, easily realizing this, went a step further and submitted that the mere fact that the universality of Christianity, of its presence in all the other religions, would, even if true, be irrelevant. Troeltsch's insight could have been even deeper. Not only is such an understanding of the universality of Christianity irrelevant historically or objectively, because it has yet to be proved in the actual confrontation, which always takes several generations and even corrodes the elements thus confronted, but also, were it to become a fact, such a universality would be vacuous from the Christian view itself. Neither its validity nor its universality is ultimate if it is not instinctive and immediate, just as humility ceases to be authentic if it is contrived and prompted by ulterior motives. How could Christianity become universal, and what could such universality mean when Western man himself can hardly be said to be faithful to the Christian tradition, when the discrepancy between it and our culture is growing wider and wider? Christianity ceases to be universal not when it fails to supersede other religions or destroy other cultural traditions, or cannot assume them. It ceases to be universal when, no longer relevant to its particular culture, it espouses foreign religio-cultural complexions. The relevance depends neither on the universality nor the supremacy of Christianity. It is comparatively easier to achieve a monopoly of universality or supremacy than to fecundate a culture which will incarnate the relevance. Neither mass baptisms nor the Crusades were an index of the relevance of Christianity. Gaining the world, Christianity would not necessarily preserve its soul. Culture is as relevant to religion as the earth was to Adam's sweat. It is also a cage. Just as the city is a cage, no other places, always this, your earthly landfall, and no ship exists to take you from yourself. Ah, don't you see? Just as you've ruined your life in this one plot of ground, you've ruined its worth everywhere now, over the whole earth. Having squandered its responsibilities at home, Christianity can hardly claim to exercise them elsewhere, or to be more authentic than any other religion. There is a sophisticated way of putting this. Christianity should not seek to impose itself. Mariton remarks that it is unbearably embarrassing to be confronted with the religious zeal of Mr. So-and-so and to subject another person to one's own. Perhaps this is why he thinks that religious pluralism is now the only course of relevant Christian action, whether at home or abroad. Within the fragmentation of Christian allegiances, as well as in relation to non-Christian loyalties, Jaspers may well lament this growing impotence of the churches and the inefficacy of any humanism, even distantly allied with the Christian tradition. It is a fact that Christianity no longer is the object of an absolute confidence. The cleavage between Christianity and Western culture is an effect of the Christian tradition itself. This cleavage has a paradoxical accompaniment in that Western culture is too Christian for Christianity to be disassociated from it. It is not Christian enough for its fate to be sealed with that of Christianity. It is evolving in a direction opposite from that of Christianity. To say that Christianity stands or falls with Western culture means that it stands or falls with the Christian elements of this culture. But these elements have fallen. This is the real meaning of the now religious, now immanentist secularism typical of our age. The crisis of our age is involved with the substitution of secular for the Christian fundamentals of Western culture.